Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of the quarantine and schooling at home. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're staying sane and, I don't know, learning a new hobby or something like that. I wanted to go over a few things with you today before we get started about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're going to get into that, but we need to review a couple of things from last week from Mrs. Barr and Mr. Harper. In particular, the origins of the 3 Abrahamic religions. So just a quick overview, a second here. Jews believe in Yahweh, which we call God, which Muslims call Allah. There is a lineage that goes through Abraham, that's why it's called the Abrahamic religions, that can be found in all 3 holy books. If you are Muslim, you believe that your lineage, your family lineage, would go through Ishmael, because that was the first son of Abraham, because it was believed that Abraham and Sarah could not have children, so he had a child with a woman named Hagar. However, later on, his wife Sarah did get pregnant and had a child named Isaac. If you are Christian or Jewish, that is the lineage that you would follow. So that is a little bit of background on that. I say that just to give you a little heads up. We're going to be talking about Jerusalem a little bit later on. When we talk about Jerusalem, I'm going to point out a couple of places in Jerusalem that are sacred to all 3 religions. For different reasons at times. So you'll see why it's so contentious. So let's get this thing started. If you guys want to grab this document and have it ready to go so you can type or write along however you want to do it, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is going to go in conjunction with today's lesson. So let's get back over here. And I'm sorry if this is clunky. Not very good at this. Haven't really done it that much yet. So do my best. Thanks, guys. Here we go. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Okay. When we look at this, guys, understand that this is majority of Israelis, and that's not all, are Jewish. And the majority of Palestinians are Muslims. That is not to say that all Israelis are Jewish and all Palestinians are Muslim. There's Christian of both. There's some that mix and mingle. Just for all intents and purposes for what we're doing today, understand that when I say the Palestinians, I'm talking about Muslims. When I talk about the Israelis, I'm talking about primarily Jews. So let's get rocking. All right, anti-Semitism in Europe, guys. When we talk about anti-Semitism in Europe, this is nothing new. This goes back forever. If you studied the Black Death, right, the plague, you probably learned about how Jews were blamed for a lot of this because Jews were not getting the plague as bad as their counterparts around the area of Europe were. Because while if you were Christian, you bathed maybe twice in your life, like baptism and then maybe death. And if you were wealthier, obviously, you could have more. But part of the Jewish religion is keeping clean. And as we know, the rats that were infesting the area were carrying fleas. And if you were dirty, they'd get on you and you would get the Black Death or the plague and die. So the problem with this is Jews aren't dying at the same rate as Christians were. So the Christians are like, hey, you guys, you poisoned our well. And they started scapegoating them that way. Another reason that this goes back is whenever there was an economic turmoil, and this even happened up through 2008, Jews get blamed because early Christians were not allowed to lend each other money with interest. So you can imagine if I came up to you and said, hey, give me 10 grand. And you might want to give me the 10 grand, but you want something for that, right? Because otherwise you could be investing that 10 grand and putting it someplace else. Well, early on, Christians couldn't lend each other that, so they turned to the Jewish community to do so. So whenever anything goes bad in the economy, people get blamed. They get scapegoated, okay? And I'm going to be looking down every once in a while, referring to my notes here just to make sure I'm covering all the things I want to cover. But so the Black Death, the wells, early Christians loaning, World War I, they actually had a Jewish consensus that was set up. This was to track down and basically find out whether the Jewish population was going to support their government or not. This happened mostly in Germany, and many Jews did fight on the front lines for the Germans. But again, I'm sure you've read or heard about Mein Kampf. It's called My Struggle by Adolf Hitler. He blamed the Jews for losing World War I. So you can obviously tell he had a little bit of bias right there. But that's just a short history of it. There's a lot more in there, guys. That's just a brief piece that I wanted to share with you. You have seen this as of late, too. If you remember recently in Charlottesville, in Virginia, at University of Virginia, there was the Unite the Right rally. And if you watch that, when they're carrying the tiki torches and walking around, they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And they would say that over and over again because they're still scapegoating the Jews and blaming them for any problems that they see in the world. It's one of their number one go-tos. The other one you would hear in there, they would chant "blood and soil." Blood and soil was a chant used by Nazis during World War II as they were taking over places. Because they believed in strong living space, that they needed more living space, and it was once there. So that's just a little bit more on it. If we go up to where we're going to be talking about right around World War II, you guys have heard about the Holocaust, obviously, and you're going to be studying that in our next unit after we get on with the Middle East. So I wanted to let you guys know what anti-Semitism is. It quite literally means the hatred and hostility towards Jews. Most Jews were forced to live in ghettos, and ghettos are, well, let me say this. They became walled-in areas where you had your own economy, where they weren't allowed to leave, at least unless they were under supervision. And they were treated as second-class citizens. And this goes along with the Nuremberg laws, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on when we talk about the Holocaust. So let's look at some other early issues in Europe. The Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus was a high-ranking French army officer. He was of Jewish descent, and because he was of Jewish descent, he was accused of being a spy for the Germans. That was totally false. But because he was Jewish, he did not get the same representation. He was forced to be stripped of all of his. If you look on his coat here and stuff, all of that was cut off in front of a whole military parade and basically dressed down. And he was put in prison. I believe it was for 5 years. Don't quote me on that one. But I believe it was for 5 years. It was a very strong anti-Semitism at that time. However, later on, he was freed because they found the guy who was actually spying. And the interesting thing about Alfred Dreyfus is when he came out of prison and he was reinstated into the military, his rank went up, and they gave him a commission and moved him up in rank. But this is just an idea of giving you the stereotypes that people are going to follow, that the Jews are not as patriotic as other people as well. So this is around the time when what is called the Zionist movement starts. This is Theodor Herzl. I'll be honest with you, I have an old neighbor that looks exactly like this guy. His name's Matt. He looks super creepy, just like this dude. But anyway, I digress. The Zionist movement was started by Theodor Herzl, and he wanted it basically to become, he wanted a Jewish state, a state for Jews where they could call home. This was somewhat controversial because you have to think about where you're going to be getting that land from. It's not like well, actually I take that back. Some places are building more land. China's doing the South China Sea, Abu Dhabi, you can see the islands there and stuff. But at that time, they weren't doing that. So the Zionist movement basically comes to the point where it says, come back home, Jews. Okay? Come to your home, your Jewish home. And it was a movement to rebuild that Jewish nation in Palestine. But the problem with that is people were already living there. And it's not like if I came over to your house and kicked you out of your house, now I'd probably get arrested on my way over. But anyway, and just said, you got to move. You're not going to do that willingly. Okay? So that's what you're running up against here. Now, in 1917, there was a declaration by the Prime Minister of England that Jews would get their own state, and that this state would be in what is we call modern day Israel, but Palestine at the time. The problem with this is the Brits, as the Brits tend to do, the Brits promised the Jews in Europe, if they supported the Brits in World War I financially, they would get the homeland. But here's the catch: they also promised the Muslim population, the Arab population around there, that they too would have their own if they supported them militarily against the Ottoman Empire, and led by a guy named Lawrence of Arabia. So they promised the same piece of land to two groups of people, and in the end, they didn't do anything with either of them. Neither of them got what they had bargained for. The Brits held on to that area and still controlled it. It wasn't, they just basically used them for their money and their military. So, but there is a strong movement after this for Jews to move back to Palestine to create their own state. Again, that's called Zionism. But the problem with that is for them is, as it shows down here, 98% of Palestine at that time was Muslim. So you can understand why that would be a problem. Okay, moving on here. I'm not going to go into exactly everything in the Holocaust right now, because if I did that, it would be basically stepping on our next unit, and I don't need to do that at this point. You guys have an idea what it was, but what happens next is, after you have Adolf Hitler and the rise and fall of the Third Reich, the World War II ends on technically August 10th, after the second bomb was dropped, but Germany fell a few months before that. When both the Russians and the other Allied forces were coming in, they were experiencing and finding these death camps. You've heard of some of them, Dachau, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, all of these places. As the soldiers came in, they couldn't believe what they were finding. And rolling out over a certain amount of time, a lot of these institutions that they had set up, they're starting to find more and more of, and when I say institutions, I mean they were institutions of mass murder. But they were also used for things like experiments and stuff like that. And as the years go on, people start to keep on hearing bits and pieces of what was going on during the Holocaust. So there was a huge, huge push and I guess a lot of empathy for the Jewish population. And you can understand that too, right? I mean, when you're finding out what they were doing to children and making lampshades out of human skin and stuff like that, you can see why you'd have empathy for this group of Jews that didn't do anything to deserve that at all. So the United Nations comes in, and they actually decide that they're going to try and help fix the problem. Therein lies the problem. Just think about this a second. If you have 100 acres of your own, okay, and if you have 100 acres, you own that, and I came up to you and I said, you have to give this 100 acres, you have to give 50 of it to your neighbor. You're not going to want to do that, especially since you own it. It's yours, right? Especially, who am I to tell you that you have to give it up? I'm nobody. It's the same thing with the United Nations at this point, telling them that. So what happens is Britain and the United Nations start to come up with their own United Nations partition plan, which would split up Palestine into two states, Israel and Palestine. The problem is, like I just said, you're not going to want to move out of your house, neither do the Palestinians. They don't want to move off from their own land. Why would they give up something that is already theirs to somebody that they don't want there, and it's being taken from them by somebody that had nothing to do with that area? So let's move on to the next portion here. This gives you an idea of what the United Nations wanted to do and have it look like. Obviously, the bluish gray there is the Jewish state. The Arab state would be orange. And then the international zone, the United Nations had proposed that it would govern the city of Jerusalem because it is so sacred to the three Abrahamic religions. Therefore, their argument was nobody should have it. Okay, so they were going to keep it there. You can probably see some obvious issues with this because of where it's split up, who gets good land. Down here later on, you're going to see that this is the Gaza Strip. That is terrible land. And again, the Palestinians, they own it. So why would they want to give up this blue area to the Jews? Okay. So again, they reject it because just like you would, you don't want to have to give up half of your land just because I told you to. Okay. But this is where it gets a little sticky, and the United States really comes in on this. We have, since the inception of Israel in 1948, we have been very, very strong supporters of Israel. Now, you might think, oh, that's just because we felt bad for the Jewish population. Well, I would like to believe it was altruistic, but let's be honest. It's a great spot to have control and bases in the Middle East. So it's strategic. Yes, there were people that thought that the Jewish population should have their own homeland. And Christians would believe that as well because Christians see their lineage through Jews. Okay. So that being said, it's interesting because President Truman, even though Congress at the time did not want him to do this, he actually said he was supporting the Zionist movement to create the state of Israel. Now, you might think, okay, who's the United States versus the United Nations? The United Nations was just formed. It was a very, very weak body, arguably still is to a certain degree. The United States, on the other hand, came out of World War II, and this is when we become the big kid on the block. This is Britain is just torn up, and because of the war, they basically stepped back from being the world's policeman, and we stepped forward. So we did support that. The United States did, and I don't know why but this transferred to being so small down here. The countries in the area unite and join to push the Jews out of the Middle East. They called themselves the Arab League. If you are Arab, again, Arab is just the area, the Arabian Peninsula. It does not necessarily mean that you're Muslim, but you probably are. Okay. So 1948, they proclaimed the state of Israel, and the Arabs launched their first of several wars. Let me say this, ladies and gentlemen, that those wars that have gone on, the Israeli government has never lost a war. Now you're thinking, okay, well, how are they actually that solid? And remember our last slide, who I told you was backing them. That would be us. If you looked at their military at this time, if you looked at what they were using, a lot of that was supplied by us. Okay. You also have at this time a movement, what is called kibbutzism. Now, this is going to sound weird, but this is where a kibbutz is a commune, like a commune where a bunch of people live together. They buy up a piece of land as much as they can, and they move more people in. And after World War II, because of everything that had gone on, then there was a huge flood of Jews to Israel because they didn't want to live places, like Germany at that time, where that could happen. And they thought if they had their own home state that they wouldn't face as much problems. I would like to say that this is 1948, the day that they declared themselves a state. The day after that, they are at war with, I believe, 6 or 7 of their neighbors. They won. So, okay. The big one now I'm not going to talk about all of those. If we had a different format, we probably could. If we were in class, I talk about it with my students, but I'm just going to hit on a couple of them. The big one that we're going to talk about today is the 6-Day War. The 6-Day War, you're not going to believe this. It did not last 5 days. It didn't last 7 days. That's right. It lasted 6. I know, shocker. And if you guys get that wrong on a test, I have no sympathy for you. Israel launches a preemptive attack on Egypt and takes over the Sinai Peninsula. Now, I'm going to show you the Sinai Peninsula in a little bit here and where it's located and what it's known for, etc. But Israel also enters the Gaza Strip and defeats the Egyptian forces and eventually enters the West Bank. And now they call it the West Bank because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River. And they defeat the Jordanians there. So looking at this map right here, this is the Sinai Peninsula right here, the gray. That is taken over by the Israelis. Now, this area right here is later given back to Egypt when Egypt recognizes Israel as its own state. Is what they do is they basically give it back to them as long as they patrol this border so that where the Gaza Strip is, you can't, the Gaza Strip is basically surrounded so that people cannot move about. And it's, again, I've said this before, it's a terrible, terrible living conditions. They're basically blockaded in here today. And these are the two places right here. You have the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. This is the West Bank. Here's the Jordan River. Okay. This is considered the West Bank area. Okay. This area right here, the gray in here, is now controlled by the Israelis. This is pretty much what it looks like still today, with the exception of the West Bank is peppered with Jewish settlements. And we'll get into that in a little bit here. The wars against Israel, the Arab League kept going back. It just never worked out for them. They were defeated, like I said, every single time. So it happened in, you saw it earlier, the dates. But just understand that at this time, there is a large, large migration from all over the world again into Israel. Okay. In the 80s, this is when you have what are called intifadas. Intifada just means an uprising. So an intifada is an uprising of the Arab population, in particular the Palestinians, against the Israeli military establishment. Now, I want to point something out to you guys. This is happening. This has been in the news quite a bit. There's an intifada, an uprising in the Gaza Strip just last year where I forget the exact number of people that were killed. But yeah, there's been uprisings. And this is still a very, very dangerous place. It's considered one of the most dangerous places to live in the world. You'll notice something here. This picture is showing a guy throwing something at a tank. Now, this is not because the Palestinians don't want to have tanks. The Israelis make sure that they don't get tanks and certain weapons. They're fine with them throwing rocks. They're not allowed to have guns. The Palestinians aren't. And some people, because they will use suicide bombings as a method to get back at the Israelis or to attack the Israelis, a lot of people call them terrorists. Now, you got to be careful with that one because even King George III called the American colonists terrorists. Under definition, technically, we were early on in the war, or even before the war started, I should say, because we didn't wear uniforms and stuff like that. We were doing guerrilla war tactics, very much what we'll talk about a group called the PLO does. But understand that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I'm sure that the American colonists would not have called themselves terrorists. It's the same thing with the Palestinians. They would argue they're not terrorists. If they had other means to attack the Israelis or to defend themselves against the Israelis, they would use it. Of course, they would love a Black Hawk helicopter or something along those lines instead of rocks, okay? But you'll see how they're cordoned off quite literally by a wall that goes around them, checkpoints, and barbed wire and everything else. So they cannot, the only way that they actually can get stuff in is tunneling underneath, and that's very dangerous. And if you want to check out a really cool interview and a clip and investigative reporting by Vice News. You can look it up on YouTube, and it talks about the tunnels underneath Gaza. So anyway, that's just a sidebar if you want to check that out. Now on to the PLO. The PLO is the main group that is going to be in opposition to the Israelis. It is a form of very loose government at that time, but the United States saw and sees the PLO as more of a terrorist group. But again, the Palestinians didn't see them that way because they were fighting. They believed that the Palestinian Liberation Organization was fighting for their rights to retain their land, for an education and an economy. We'll know about the bad things that they do, like blowing up, using suicide bombers on buses and stuff like that. They also do some positive things. Otherwise, obviously, the Palestinians wouldn't vote for them. For example, they set up healthcare systems, daycare, training, and stuff like that. The other thing I want to point out to you is people will do desperate things when they're desperate. In some places around Palestine, but around like the West Bank, you have, and even Gaza Strip, you have 60% unemployment. That's going to hit you pretty hard, and you don't see any hope, so you're willing to do anything. One of the big things that throughout history there's a couple movies about it. I think ask your mom and dad first before you watch it, because I think it's rated R, called Munich, and it was about the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich, Germany, where in Germany you had the PLO take over basically the barracks, not barracks, but the sleeping quarters in the village, the Olympic Village of the Israeli athletes. Okay. And they believe that it was masterminded by this guy that you see in the picture right here, Yasser Arafat. He was the head of the PLO at that time. He died, I believe, in like 2007. Here are just a few pictures from that when they took them hostage. This is called this is in Munich at the Olympic Village, and this is a group called Black September. They were a part of the PLO. They were called Black September. They were the ones that took the hostages. There was a hostage attempt to get these guys out and safe. It did not go well. In the end, this group of people right here, these 11 Olympic athletes or coaches, referee, were killed during that shootout. The Black September, the PLO, did get away with executing these 11. This is you might have seen in the 2008 Olympics, there was actually at the beginning, it was Beijing. They paid homage and honor to these guys that were killed during the 1972 Olympics. Okay. When this happens, by the way, guys, when this happens, it only furthers the split between the Arab Muslim population in Palestine and the Western world. So we become more ardently pro-Israel at that time because of their actions in the 1972 Olympics. Now let's fast forward a little bit to the Oslo Accords. Now there's a lot of different meetings that people tried to get the Palestinians and the Jewish population of the Israelis together so that there could be peace. Okay, this is on the left is Yitzhak Rabin. He is meeting with, that's right, Yasser Arafat. These two men hate each other. If you really want to see something kind of funny, there's another meeting headed up by President Bill Clinton at that time at Camp David, where the two men, it's not Rabin, it's a different prime minister, but they won't allow each other to be the last to go through a door. In their culture in the Middle East, it is a sign of power to be the last one to go through the door. So these two actually get into, if you just watch it, pull it up on YouTube and put Camp David Accords and put door. You'll get a kick out of it, because these two guys, literally, they're not even sitting down yet to discuss peace, and they're getting into a little pushing contest before they even get into Camp David with President Clinton. So the two areas after the Oslo Accords, that what came of this, they were the Oslo Accords, the Camp David Accords, basically allowed the Palestinians to have some limited self-rule. The Israelis were still going to be able to tell them what they could and couldn't do, but they could form a government and have a little bit of rule over themselves. Okay. They also returned the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to the PLO, but many Israelis move into that area later on. So in other words, the Oslo Accords don't actually hold up very well, because you're going to see in a moment what's been happening to the West Bank. Now, when all this is going on and many more Jews are moving to Israel, it pushes out the Palestinian population. Many of them get pushed to their north. And when they get pushed to their north, they move into Lebanon and form a group, again, the United States sees as a terrorist group, Hezbollah, and they have committed terrorist acts against the United States as well, I might add. But yeah, it's this is where every once in a while they lob a few rockets across that northern border, and it happened in 2006. And basically, Israel, land, sea, and air bombed half of the southern half of Lebanon back into the Stone Age. Even President Bush at that time said that was a very heavy-handed reaction to, I believe it was around 5 rockets. I think it was like 5 or 6 mortar rockets that were fired across the northern border. So that's the group that they're fighting against there, and we deem them, Hezbollah is seen as a terrorist group. Now, what I wanted to show you here, this is a present-day map of Palestine and Israel. Here you have the Gaza Strip. This area is surrounded by the Israelis. People are not allowed to come and go as they please. And when I say this, I mean quite literally, this area right here, which is in the Mediterranean Sea, that is also cordoned off from anybody coming in. I forget how many years ago it was, but there was Turkey sent what's called a flotilla that had a bunch of medical supplies in it for the people of the Gaza Strip. The Israelis attacked the ships and people were killed. So basically they're living in this little box here. It's not going well at all. Up here in the West Bank, I want you to see this. This is what it's supposed to look like, that the Palestinians have this area and this area. Now, that is not necessarily what it is. That's what they're supposed to have, but that's not what happens. This is the area I was telling you guys about, tunneling underneath Egypt into Gaza, so that you could look that up on YouTube for Vice News. This is what we're looking at. Remember, we talked about it before with 98% of the population was Muslim. This is in 1947. These are where the Jewish settlements were, the white. And the green was Palestine. Okay? So there is no Israel at this time. Looking over here, this was the partition plan I mentioned earlier, the UN partition plan. This is after the 1967 war. You can see they took out here's Jerusalem right here. They took out this part of Jerusalem, and they cut into this area. This is what it looks like today. The Gaza Strip, all still that Arab Muslim population, but look at what's gone on here. All of these white areas in here, even though, according to the Oslo Accords, this should be Palestinian, Jewish population has been moving in here and taking over and building what are called Jewish settlements, okay? Now, those Jewish settlements, originally, they weren't supposed to be going in there. In fact, early 2000s in the Gaza Strip here, you had Israelis go in there and remove other Israelis. That's why it's so solid right now. I think it was 9 families. And it was so traumatic for the entire country of Israel when Israel is using its own military on its own people to remove them to what they consider the Holy Land, right? I mean, let's not forget, this is the idea here of this place, is that it's holy to all 3 Abrahamic religions. So each of them believed that God, Allah, Yahweh, promised that land to them. So after that happened, basically, the Israeli government does not stop the Jewish population from moving into the West Bank. This is not going well because in this area, these areas that where the Palestinian population still is, they put up large walls around all of them, meaning that they can't come and go as they please. Like there's one gentleman I showed my class a clip of. His farm is literally on the other side of the wall. He can't get to his farm, and they're not allowed to use cars. They can only use horse and buggy still. And they have to, if you guys remember going back to apartheid, they have to have ID on them at all times and carry it with them in order to get to the checkpoint. You can imagine the problems this causes because oftentimes they're not allowed to move about from one place to another. So you might not be able to go to work that day. People aren't allowed to go visit their family. There is a mayor of a town that 16 times he applied to go visit his sister and her family in Jerusalem. That was, I believe geographically, it was less than 20 miles away. But he was not allowed to do that. And it had been several years since he had seen his family. So that kind of gives you an idea that it's not good to be living in that area. It's, again, 60% unemployment. Yeah. Now, we're at the part on that reading guide that you guys, or the notes guide, where it talks about the three major problems to obstacles to peace between Israel and Palestine. There's three major things. The first one is land claims, okay? In other words, the right to return for Palestinians, that they would like to be able to return to their homeland and to resettle in Israel. Obviously, just like what the Palestinians did when the UN partition plan was proposed to them, they said no. Same thing here. They obviously oppose this because they argue it's already ours. We've got it now. But if you don't do that, you're still going to get people fighting in suicide attacks and mortars and stuff like that. So that's the first one, land claims. The second one is, as I mentioned a little bit ago, the Jewish settlements in occupied lands, what they call the occupied lands, and that would be the West Bank. It's basically squeezing the Palestinians out of the area that they had agreed to that would be theirs, along with the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in the Oslo Accords. The third biggest problem is this place right here. If you guys want, there is a cool video that you can look up. It's called Peter Jennings' Jerusalem Stories. That's what it is, Jerusalem Stories. It's an old one, but it'll explain a lot of this very, very well. And it also gets into some of the areas. There's quarters, like there's a Jewish quarter, there's the Muslim quarter, and it gets into all of this, all of them living together in Jerusalem. Now, I said to you guys earlier that how closely and why the United Nations wanted to keep this as an international city. Both the Israelis and the Palestinians want this as their capital. The problem is there's so much history, religious history, layered upon layer upon layer inside of Jerusalem. In this single picture right here, I'm showing you the most sacred place in all of Judaism. This is called the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. This is what was left of Solomon's temple from a long, long time ago. At some point, the Jewish population believed that they're going to rebuild the temple. And that is their belief through the Torah. The problem is this right here is called the Dome of the Rock. It's a mosque. It's a Muslim mosque that quite literally sits in the same spot that the temple was once for Temple Solomon. And in the background, here's a Christian icon. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they believe that Jesus was put to death. There's 6 different Christian groups there that fight each other. If you watch the Jerusalem Stories video by Peter Jennings, that even the Christians are fighting amongst themselves about who gets access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, Jerusalem, as far as a city goes, the old city is not very big at all. And so you have all of these 3 major groups plopped in on top of one another, vying for the same land. This place right here, where the mosque is at, the Dome of the Rock, is sacred to Jews and Christians because it's believed where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac to God before God stopped him. Muslims, on the other hand, believe it was the spot where Ishmael was to be sacrificed, and they also believe that this was the spot where Muhammad ascended into heaven to get the word of God for the Quran. Okay, so you can see why this place is sacred to everybody, but also it's a very, very, very contentious place. And again, we don't have time to go into all of this, but yeah, you can look up some extra stuff on that. Some problems today. Israel still remains what's called the occupied territories that are supposed to belong to Palestine. Israel enters into Palestinian areas and takes over. We talked about that. Israel does not let the Palestinians travel freely and in and out of the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. It makes it difficult for them to form any strong economies, right? Because you don't know which days you're going to be able to go to work. So Palestine has teamed up with terrorist groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, also has been funded by a group or a country we don't like very well, Iran. They use suicide bombers and guerrilla attacks are the most common. And as I said before, the United States, we support Israel no matter what, really. That's led to a lot of animosity amongst the Arab Muslim population in that area and across the Middle East towards us, because no matter what, we end up on the side of Israel. So like I mentioned earlier, moving the embassy. So let's look at possible solutions to this, guys. Over 70% of the Palestinians in the West Bank and over 50% of Israelis believe that there should be a two-state solution. Now, this is interesting because you're looking at over 50% of Israelis believe that. That's a strong number. And then you ask, well, why, if they have a majority? Because of the way that their government is set up. You do not have reformers leading the government at this point in time. Others feel there should be a lifting of restrictions and basically letting the Palestinians be part of Israel, and that way they could move about freely, be free to make money for themselves, etc., and they wouldn't have as much reason to attack the Israelis. Obviously, other people think nothing should change. So, that all being said, this is that last question on that sheet. What do you think? What do you think the solution should be? Keep in mind, usually I have my kids do a large project on this. You guys are just going to write a few sentences on who should get it and why, or how it should be worked out and why. So thanks for listening today. I hope you guys are staying healthy and sane. Be good to one another. Be good to your parents especially. It's not easy on anybody right now. So thank you very much and have a great day.